So next on our investigation of virtue ethics is Aristotle. Of course, we've talked about Socrates. Socrates, the teacher of Plato. After Plato, Aristotle, a 20-year student of Plato's. Aristotle creates something similar to Plato's Academy, creates his Lyceum. And Aristotle really rejects many of those fundamentals held by Socrates and Plato. So what you see here is the work by Raphael, School of Athens. In the center there, you see Plato and Aristotle. And with a close-up, you get kind of an image of how they are different. So Plato, who has the finger pointed up, he takes those fundamental tenets of Socrates, the idea that there is absolute objective truth. Now for Socrates, Socrates was specifically interested in the meaning of life, in absolute truth for virtue, etc. Whereas Plato takes this concept of there being an absolute truth when it comes to virtue, ethics, morals, etc., and he expands that notion to reality itself, right? And postulates there being absolute truth when it comes to physical reality. So Plato gives us his formal reality, and this would be a place, an actual place where forms exist, and forms are the what you might call prototypes for things of this world. They are the absolutely perfect versions of the things we see in this world. So it is our job, as Plato conceives it, to use our reason, our intellect, our logic to understand, to have an understanding of formal reality. This, the Allegory of the Cave, this comes out of Plato's Republic. This is a story he tells so that we may better understand the concept of formal reality. So we are these prisoners here chained, staring at. So we as these prisoners, what we see these shadows that are cast on this cave wall. Because we're chained down, our heads can't turn and we can't stand up or move. And then here people are walking across with objects. And then this fire casts the shadow of those objects on the cave wall. So this is, Plato believes, our reality as we understand it, that we are living in a world of illusion, right? So this is another way of understanding Plato's version of reality. This is the divided line. So your job is to go from the world of illusion to wisdom, and wisdom is out of the cave, where you actually come into contact or have an understanding of formal reality. St. Augustine, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks, takes this idea of an absolutely perfect world that is a place that we want to know, want to be a part of, want to understand, right? He takes this concept from Plato and gives us a way to understand the Christian concept of heaven. So that's a good way to think of formal reality. A perfect second reality, that everything in this world, in our world, everything is a copy, right? And a poor copy at that, because one thing we know about this world is that it's constantly changing, constantly in flux. Whereas for Plato, again, because there is this belief that truth must be absolute and unchanging, capital T truth cannot be in this world. It has to be somewhere else. And so that's where we get this idea of formal reality. Now, Aristotle. You'll see Aristotle has his hand towards the ground, and he's actually carrying his ethics there. Aristotle believed that Plato was completely wrong. Right? Plato, again, his teacher of 20 years. Now, Aristotle doesn't publish this while Plato's alive. He waits till he's dead. But rejects Plato's theory of forms, rejects Plato's conception of the world, of reality. And there are many reasons he does so. So a good way to conceptualize the philosophers that we're going to talk about this semester is to see them, and I mentioned this one with the early Greeks, the pre-Socratics, that they are in conflict with one another. So you have Socrates and Plato, and keep in mind the only information we have about Socrates we get via Plato. Now that's aside from a couple of other sources, but the majority of our information comes from Plato and his dialogue. So Plato, Socrates, Aristotle is a rejection of Plato and Socrates. So Aristotle gives us another way to conceptualize virtue ethics, that the goal is still the same. That is happiness, eudaimonia, right? So here's some background on Aristotle. You know the story of him teaching Alexander the Great. Very famous stories of Alexander sending specimens back from his travels, and Aristotle cataloging the biological facts of these specimens, these newly discovered species, etc. So for Aristotle, there are three kinds of knowledge. There's theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge, and productive knowledge. Now our focus is going to be on the practical, right? That is ethics. This is the kind of knowledge that deals with rules that are not fixed, right? That they are inexact. Okay, so here are the reasons he rejects Plato's theory of forms. Again, the importance of this is simply to understand where Aristotle fits into the history of Western thought. This is not his ethics, but a good way to understand Aristotle in a distinct way. Okay, so for Plato, and in Plato's Republic, he would, in his perfect state, he would throw out all of the artists and all of the poets. Now, why would he do that? Well, Plato believed that art, which in his mind was always imitation, is bad, harmful to individuals, right? Because keep in mind, for Plato, the purpose of your life is to seek wisdom, right? And you do that through utilizing your logic, your ability to reason. That's how you get to the pinnacle of understanding, right? Is using your reason. That's the goal of your life, is to understand the forms. So for Plato, art negatively affected you in two ways. First, it affected you morally because it made you emotional. It affected you emotionally. So you're not able to focus on your goal, which is that getting knowledge, wisdom of the forms, right? So it distracts you. And then secondly, art, because Plato believed it was solely imitation, that if you think about a painting of a chair, right? So you have the chair, say the one you're looking at physically, the one you're sitting on. Plato would say that that's a copy of the pure chair, right? The prototypical chair, which is the form. So that thing that you're actually dealing with, that you're sitting on, the physical chair, is a copy. Now, if I draw a picture of that chair, I'm taking you one step further away from where you should be going, right? Which is knowledge of the form, right? So it's a copy of a copy, harms us intellectually. Now, Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that art could be good for us, right? Aristotle believed that we learn through imitation, that for Aristotle, he's very much on developing good, positive habits. So for him, art was a good thing morally, that when you watch drama occur, right, and for him he's specifically talking about tragedy, and when you see people interact on stage, you're getting lessons in how to act, how to interact with people different from you. So some insight into ethical behavior watching these individuals interact with one another. And then number two, he believed it was actually art, drama, was beneficial to us intellectually because it provides an outlet for our negative emotions, right? He called this is catharsis, right? That you're able to purge your negative emotions. So when you watch Oedipus Rex gouge his eyes out, you feel better. After watching this tragic event occur, you can better focus on those intellectual pursuits now that you've purged the negative emotions. All right, so on to Aristotle's Ethics. Now he writes, he has two principal works on ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son, Nicomachus. And so the focus of Aristotle's ethics is the same. It is still a virtue ethics. That your goal is the same, right? Eudemonia. And he conceptualizes eudaimonia as the highest good because it is the only thing desirable for itself. That is, when we think about happiness, we don't want happiness because it brings us pickup trucks and chocolate chip cookies, right? We want happiness for its own sake, right? We go and we get the pickup truck and the chocolate chip cookies because those things bring us closer to happiness. So Aristotle sees happiness, eudaimonia, as the highest good. Again, desirable for itself, and it's the only thing he thinks that is desirable for its own sake, right? That we want everything else because they provide a vehicle to happiness. So again, the virtues for Aristotle, there are for him virtues of the intellect, right? That's reason. And then virtues of character, which we talked about with Socrates, temperance, courage, etc. But, and this is the pivotal difference between Aristotle and Socrates when it comes to virtue and virtue ethics, that for Socrates, if you recall, Socrates says that to know the good is to do the good. Right? So that once you have knowledge of the virtue, that is, once you have knowledge of courage, you will be unable to act cowardly. Right? Once you have the knowledge, right, you will always act accordingly. For Aristotle, he believed that virtue is a skill. It's a habit. It's something that you must practice. Right? That you must do again and again. That for him, early in life, when we're young, we're taught how to reason. Right? We're taught theoretical knowledge. But then it's later in life, after we have this foundation of how to reason, that we're able to put to use or sort out practical knowledge, practical wisdom, right? Okay, so there are three, what we might call states of ethical existence, states of being, right? There is the continent person who's in control, There's the incontinent person who tries, right? Again, virtue is a habit, it's an activity, it's a skill. So the person who is incontinent, they want to be moral and ethical. They're not having as good a luck. And then the evil person who just refuses to try to control him or herself. That's evil for Aristotle. A person who doesn't try to attain the virtues, to do virtuous activity. But there's a little caveat here, as you'll see, right? Aristotle believed that that the evil person, that's kind of a self-correcting, in that if you're not acting virtuously, if you're not attempting to be a virtuous person, that you're not going to be achieving your goals. And so eventually you'll come around. Okay, so this is Aristotle's ethical theory. This is the standard by which we can judge virtuous activity. It's the golden mean. That virtue is a state between excess and deficiency. Right? So you've got two ends of a spectrum. You have, say you want to be generous, and on the one hand, on the lower end, you have the someone who's a spendthrift, right? Who a penny pincher, say, and then on the other hand, you have someone who gives everything away, right? So you have two extremes, and so for Aristotle, virtue is going to be some generosity, or being generous is going to be in between those two extremes. It's not going to be on the low end. It's not going to be on the high end. It's going to be somewhere in between, right? And so the important thing is that to be virtuous, you have to reject both the excess and the deficiency, too much and too little, right? So this is again why virtue for Aristotle is virtuous activity, right? Because you're constantly working to find that middle ground. Okay, so here's an example with courage, right? So on the one hand, you have cowardice, right? You're a cowardly lion there. And on the other hand, you have foolhardiness, right? Which is, not taking into consideration any danger at all, right? And so to be courageous, to have courage, you reject the two extremes and try to find that mean in between those two, right? And then you can consider the extremes. If I want to be humble, right? What are the two extremes that must be rejected in order for me to be humble, a humble person? So again, what's important about Aristotle in terms of our discussions over the course of this semester, the golden mean, and that virtue, right? This is still a virtue ethics. Your goal is still eudaimonia, happiness, right? You still want to be virtuous. But for Aristotle, virtue is a skill. It's a habit. It's something that it's an activity. It's something that must be done constantly. Whereas for Socrates, right, virtue is knowledge. That once you know it, you know what it means to be courageous. You will never act cowardly once you have that knowledge.